my 1/4 inch cording. Sometimes this is comes in 5/32, but it's so close to a 1/4 inch I'm going to call it that. And then I have a more narrow piece of cording that I'm going to wrap. So I just took a little sample, and I also cut some pieces of bias strip. So let's just try wrapping a small section. And you could certainly take this to the sewing machine and just sew this down and see what you get. Or you could pin it. Here's our 2 samples. This is the 1/4 inch cording, and I cut a 2 inch wide bias strip and sewed it down with a large basting stitch. Did the same thing to this smaller piece right here. It's not extremely snug, but you get the idea. The next question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of seam allowances are you using? The cut edge lines up with the cut edge of your pillow top or cushion top or whatever application. If you're using a 5/8 inch seam allowance, then you'll need to take your ruler and determine where that 5/8 is. You can draw a line and then cut it, or 1/2 inch, whatever your preference. So for me, I like to use 1/2 inch. I'm just going to draw a little line at my 1/2 inch mark. Just to make it easier to handle, I'm just going to pull the cording out and line up my ruler along those 2 notches. And then pull these stitches out. You could use a seam ripper or sharp scissors. Okay, so I've pulled my thread apart, and this is how wide I want to cut my bias strips if I'm using a 1/4 inch or a 5/32 cord and a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So let's see what we have. So this piece came to about 1 7/8, so it was almost 2 inches, but not quite. 1 more eighth off and it would be 1 3/4 inches. Depending on what fabric you're using, it could take more or a little bit less width to wrap your cord and still have a 1/2 inch seam allowance left over. Using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm lining my ruler up, making a little mark at 1/2 inch. I think I got that out of the camera. Let me do that again. So, or I'll just show you. So I put a little mark here, 1/2 inch, and line up my ruler. Trim that off. Snip these threads. Now remember, this is just a sample that we're making. And if you're using a particularly heavy fabric, I really recommend doing this sample piece, because the thicker your fabric is, the more it's going to take to wrap around your cord. So if I'm going to use this more narrow cording, which is about 1/8 inch, I'm going to need a width of 1.5. So my bias strips would be, once again, let me line that up so you can see it in the camera, 1.5 inch strips. So I hope that answers your questions about how wide to make your bias strips. And if you have any questions, send me a comment and I'll try to answer them right away.